I've been looking at a piece of code that I've had to either fix or maintain, and I said, what absolute cretin wrote this? What way could they possibly have been thinking at this time? This is the worst code I've ever had to deal with. I can't believe how stupid the person was who wrote it. And of course, Git blame tells me it was me.
Code is writing Know Your Reader. Big round of applause.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, it's okay, really good. Hello. So I only found out I was doing this talk about 2 weeks ago. I didn't have anything prepared at that point. I spoke at Rails SAS about 2 years ago about a different subject, and I thought, should I repurpose that talk for this, or should I do something new? And why would I make life easier for myself? So this is something completely new. Blank sheet, I thought, I'll ask ChatGPT, given what you know about me, because ChatGPT has memory now, what would be a good talk I could give at a Ruby conference? And ChatGPT gave me a bunch of really bad ideas. But the bad ideas helped me think of a good idea, or what I thought was a good idea, which is this. But I'll be honest with you, I've got a little bit of imposter syndrome here. And we've had some great talks yesterday and this morning. Something's very technical, something's very clever, but this is the only talk I've got, so this is one we're going to go with. So I want to thank ClickFunnels for allowing me to be here. I'm currently a principal engineer at ClickFunnels. I've been doing that for the last couple of years. I've been working in creating software for the internet for over 25 years now. I've been an engineer, I've been an engineering manager, I've been a CTO, I was a consultant for over 10 years, and now I'm back to being an engineer again. As you can probably tell, I'm English. So I want to start with an apology. So out of interest, I can't see you very well, but how many people here, raise your hands if you're a native speaker of English? Yeah, so we're massively in the minority here. And so I have to say, I'm really impressed with all the speakers who are presenting in something that isn't their first language. I've got a massive advantage here presenting my first language, so I should have no excuses. But yeah, okay, that's it. Yeah, but maybe I shouldn't apologise, because English is the lingua franca of technology. And as we know, the French, or the French government at least, are very precious about their language. And you can imagine they wouldn't be very happy that someone describing English as being a French language. It wouldn't be as funny as if it meant the language of the Swedes, but because it's the language of the French, it's funny. In fact, the French government have instituted a law which says that in various parts of French life, particularly advertising, you have to use French. They're that precious about it. Do you have any French speakers here? Yeah. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, it doesn't mean language of the French, does it? That would be, let me check this, langue française. I've got a terrible French accent, sorry about that. So does this joke actually work? I don't know. So what is a lingua franca? Dictionary definition, Carmen said this okay earlier, so I can use that. It's a language used for communication among people of different mother tongues. You can read the rest of it yourself. But that doesn't help us understand, is it actually correct to say it's the language of the French? So we need to look at the etymology of the phrase lingua franca. This is obviously Wikipedia. If we come down the bottom, we can find out that in all three cases, the literal sense is Frankish, leading to the direct translation, language of the Franks. Who were the Franks? Could they be the same as the French? Does that make the joke work? So let's find out who the Franks were. Originally a group of Germanic people, that doesn't sound good, who lived near the Rhine River, blah, 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 blah. They took control of a large empire, including areas that had been ruled by Rome, and what it meant to be a Frank began to evolve. Okay, sounds promising. Once they were deeply established in Gaul, and who here's read Asterix? Yeah, Gaul is France, so starting to sound more promising. The Franks became multilingual, blah, 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 blah. So much of Western Europe could eventually be described as Frank in some context. Does one joke work? Yes. Well, I thought I'd ask Google Translate. Lingua franca means French language in Corsican, but that took a lot of explanation. And a joke that requires a lot of explanation is probably a bad joke. Code is like a joke. If code needs a lot of explanation, it's probably bad. Does it start to make sense yet? Right, so now I'm back on the title of my talk after that rather long aside. So code is write and know your reader. So in writing, whether it's prose or novels or screenplays or plays, Know your reader means to thoroughly understand your intended audience demographics, needs, desires, existing knowledge and interests to effectively tailor your writing style, content and structure to resonate with them. Now, when we're writing code, we don't really care about the content resonating with our readers, but it's very important that we're communicating effectively to our readers. So this talk is why it's very important to write clear, intentional code, and it's about how Ruby helps us do that. I'm hoping in this talk I can highlight some of the beautiful things Ruby gives us to actually help us achieve this goal. And as Lucian was saying yesterday, even if some of this is really obvious to you, because we've got lots of very experienced Rubyists here, it can serve as ideas that we can use to sell Ruby to the next person who comes along looking for a new technology or stack, and we can explain why Ruby is a good choice for them. What does the programmer do? According to Uncle Bob Martin, the ratio of time spent reading versus writing is well over 10 to 1. It's a made-up number, obviously, and there's no direct evidence for it, but I think we all know that there's some truth in this. So we spend far more time reading than we do writing code. So, given that so much of our code has a lot of time spent reading been read, we've got to think about who are our readers. So, when we write code, who's going to read it? So first of all, the interpreter, which in Ruby is MRI and YARV. You also got your teammates. I mean, not all of you code in a team at the moment, but you almost certainly will at some point in your career if you don't at the moment. There's also the future version of you. It's very rare that you write some code and you never come back to it. You're going to come back to it a week, a month later and try to understand what you were thinking at the time when you originally wrote it, if you're trying to debug it or extend it or do some other sort of maintenance on it. Now, a few years ago, this would be the end of the list. But we've got a new item on the list now, of course, which is coding agents. So in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about these readers and considerations you should have when you're writing for them. So we'll talk about the interpreter first. It takes Ruby code and compiles it into bytecode, which has been true since Ruby 1.9. It's objective, predictable, and deterministic. It doesn't make any assumptions. It doesn't have any context outside the code. It doesn't have any biases. It just either compiles a bytecode, it either compiles into bytecode or it doesn't, and the bytecode either executes or it doesn't. There's no intent. It doesn't care what you're trying to do. All it knows is the actual behavior of the code. I have a little example here. There's a very trivial Ruby script. And if you convert it into bytecode, that's what it looks like. So I'm a web developer, so I don't really care about bytecode generally. I mean, who here has actually looked at bytecode before? Yeah. So if you're actually writing Ruby or doing other sort of low-level development, you may have come across it. But for many people who work at the web level, it's not something to really worry about. But before I put this talk together, I had seen bytecode before, but I've never really thought about it. It's just a thing that existed that it didn't really concern me. And what's interesting is this has the exact same semantic meaning as the code on the prior slide. And it's kind of vaguely readable, but its audience isn't humans. Its audience is the Ruby VM. So this code only has one reader, the Ruby VM, and it exists at a different level of description from the Ruby code we saw before that it's compiled from. So the thing about Ruby is Ruby encourages writing code that communicates, not just instructs. So let's look at a nice piece of Ruby code. Here we are. You're all clever Rubyists. You know what this does, don't you? Anyone? Anyone? Right. This is where I'm going to try and do the live coding. So do you have any guess about what it's going to do? Well, no, sorry, not a guess. You all know, obviously. You're just a bit too shy to tell me. Right. I'll tell you. You're obviously too shy. We throw a comment on it. Anyone fancy maintaining this? No, probably not. So we write Ruby code for humans. There are two categories of humans. There's your teammates and there's future you. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's done this. On more than one occasion in my career, I've been looking at a piece of code that I've had to either fix or maintain, and I said, what absolute cretin wrote this? What way could they possibly have been thinking at this time? This is the worst code I've ever had to deal with. I can't believe how stupid the person who wrote it. And of course, Git blame tells me it was me. It's happened a couple of times. I try not to do that anymore. So what's true of humans? We're subjective. We have assumptions. We have biases. We have contexts. We care about what the code is trying to do. When we read code, we actually try to infer its intent. And we also care about what it does, the actual behavior of the code. If there's a discrepancy between the intent and the behavior, and it's not important, we probably call it a side effect. If it is important, we probably call it a bug. And the human who reads a code doesn't have the context you did when you wrote it. You know, as coders, we sometimes get into like a flow state where we're producing lots of code and we've got lots of concepts in our heads, i.e. lots of context, and we'll probably produce a lot of code really quickly. Now, it's probably not the case that that's the right time to take a step back and go, am I making this code readable? Because by doing that, you're exactly trying to have empathy with a third person, which is going to take you directly out of the flow state. But there's nothing to stop you coming back to that same code later once you've solved the problem, or you come to a natural end, you're not in your flow state anymore, and actually thinking, is this actually good code that people are going to understand? I mean, one thing that I do, even when I'm working on a project of just my own, I'll submit a PR, which I then try and review myself as if I was a third person, trying to understand, trying to put myself in the position of someone who, or trying to put myself in the position of myself 6 months later, saying, when I come back then, will I understand this? Is there any context missing? Can I actually alter the code to make it more readable and understandable? And for humans, any ambiguity is a barrier to understanding. So what I really love about Ruby, and made me fall in love with it in the first place, is that with Ruby, more than any other language I've come across, if you just read it out loud, you can make it say what it does. So in this case, we've got a method which obviously returns an invoice, and it says, if intent.invoice present, return intent.invoice, else create invoice from intent, the intent. Saying out loud literally says what it does. There's no confusion about what this is going to do. And we can also use punctuation in method names, which I really like as well. So if we say that out loud, if user active and user admin, it's got much more semantic content than if we didn't have the punctuation. We just said, if user active and user admin. Saying it out loud actually enhances the meaning of it. Now, naming. We've had a little bit on naming so far in this conference, not very much. There's a very famous quote about naming that I've actually heard at every tech conference I've ever been to. Not this one so far. I'm not going to lean on it here because why would I make life easy for myself? I get to speak English. So I've got a different quote. You should name a variable using the same care about which you name a firstborn child. This is Uncle Bob Martin. I looked it up on Wikipedia. Uncle Bob Martin has 4 children. I feel sorry for children 2 to 4. But anyway, so I care about the names of all my children. I've got 3 of them. And my pets. So this is my cat. We got him during lockdown. He's obviously a black and white cat. You know, when you get a pet, you obviously worry about naming them. I hate cliches. I know about 6 black and white cats called Oreo, so we're never going to call it that. So we called him Draco, after the character from Harry Potter. And then a couple more months into lockdown, we're enjoying having a cat. Kids wanted a dog. We got a dog. Don't say R. And as you can see, he's a black dog. So I wanted to call him Lord Vader. But that sounds a bit stupid when he shouted across a park. Lord Vader! Lord Vader, come here! Lord Vader, you've been a naughty boy. So we had to come up with something else. So we landed on Kylo. So Star Wars fans can kind of see how that might work. But anyway, so whether it's pets or variables or classes, naming is hard. And this is not a problem that's specific to Ruby. Wittgenstein said, naming is important. Wittgenstein said, the limits of my language means the limits of my world. And what that means is words don't just describe the world, they actually affect how you understand the world as well. One word can mean multiple things. Multiple words can mean the same thing. And when writing code, it's the one part where you're really using your subjective creativity. You've got all the words and tokens from the SDK, which are preset, and everything else in terms of the letters you type is up to you. I'm just going to go to this next slide because it's funny. So this is Java. It's probably the only Java code you're going to see in this conference. I'm going to read it out. Internal frame title pane maximize button window not focus state. It's a very long name. If you were reading it, it would take you a long time to understand. It is very specific, but fortunately we don't tend to do this with Ruby. So what's a good name? A good name is descriptive, unambiguous, consistent, use terms from your domain, and you should read your names out loud just like the rest of the code. But all of this is kind of obvious, you know, but I'm not saying something very clever here. So the one bit of advice I would give to anyone about names is have a project vernacular. And what I mean by this is when you start a project, create an actual physical document, well, not physical document, an actual document where you actually write down the terms that you're going to use within your project and use it throughout your, not just software, but throughout your business, throughout your support, throughout your documentation and the UI. For example, you don't want to call something a cart in one place and a basket in another place, because then that just causes ambiguity and affects understanding. At ClickFunnels, we had this feature which we call cart funnels, and you had like in the nav, you click cart funnels and you get to the cart funnels feature. And we had that in development. And then before we actually launched it, we said, actually, it makes more sense to call it, we'll put it in the store section, let's call it store funnels. So cart funnels became store funnels. And then sometime later, we said, actually, it doesn't really make sense to call it it's not really a funnel, let's call it a store upsell. So the feature that started off as a cart funnel became a store upsell. So yes, so when you do choose to rename, you want to make sure you update your project vernacular and update your code so everything is kept consistent. Because otherwise you get this kind of semantic drift where names change over time. Cart funnel is just one example, but imagine a large code base where you've got tens of models changing names over a long period of time. And then a new engineer comes along and they need to find out all this arcane knowledge about, well, what does a cart funnel mean? You either have to do some sort of like archaeological dig of the code, go into Git history to find out what it is, or find a developer who actually knows the history of these things. It's a massive barrier to understanding. So renaming a factor as you change names within your business makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, renaming is hard in Rails. This is the one thing where our stack doesn't necessarily help us. Table and column names are coupled to code. You may have to change scopes, queries, and associations. Routes depend on resource names. Controllers of views are tied to model names. And dynamic methods may only fail at runtime. For example, find by email. The one thing I'll say about this is that in 2025, AI agents are probably very good at helping you with this sort of thing. In terms of things Ruby helps with, you can use namespacing. It communicates context, improves discoverability, supports modular design, reduces global scope pollution. And by that, I mean that if you have a namespace, then it's less likely you're going to create a class at the global level that overwrites a class that already exists. And something else that Ruby gives us that I really like is keyword arguments, which we introduced in Ruby 2. So thinking about intentional code. If we saw this code, it's fairly obvious what it does. It probably sends an email to an email address, and you can probably guess that that might be the subject in the second argument. But what if the code was this? This suddenly is a mystery. If you were the developer who was looking at this piece of code and you had to extend it or fix a bug in it, you'd be stumped to looking at this, and you'd have to go and look at the method signature to see what the third argument actually meant. So using keyword arguments, we can make it look like this. And suddenly the intention of the code is much more clear. Depending on what you're doing, whether it's urgent or not, may or may not be a concern to you. But the intention of what the third argument is doing is immediately a lot more clear. So we look at this code with some nested ifs. If you think about if you're a developer coming to try and work with it, you start reading it, you go, okay, if order paid, I've got to remember that now. If order items fulfillable to any, I've got to remember that. So you have to remember a stack of things to understand what the code is going to do. So you can replace this with guard clauses. This is the exact same code. And what's interesting about this is you only have to think about one idea at a time. So you look at the first line of code, and we'll do something unless the order is paid. Look at the second line of code. We'll do something unless the orders have any fulfillable items. Each line of code, you only have to think about one concept. You don't have to keep this stack of state in your mind to understand what's going on. Right, domain-specific languages. Ruby's really good at creating domain-specific languages. It's used all over the place in Rails, and I'll show you an example of my favorite one, active record associations. This is a brilliant example of the code literally just, you can read it out and it does what it says. So a physician has many appointments, and a physician has many patients through appointments. I mean, that's English, and it does exactly what it says. So we need to consider complexity has a cost. Ruby allows metaprogramming and monkey patching. And I'm not saying you should never do these things. I'm absolutely not saying that. We recently completed a fairly significant project at ClickFunnels with Stripe. And did I use metaprogramming in it? Yeah, a little bit. Did I use monkey patching? Yeah, in one place. But you've got to consider these things in terms of the overall developer experience. Complexity that's well placed can actually aid developer experience elsewhere. And the one thing I'll say about complexity is if you can hide it behind a well-defined intentional interface, then that's the right thing to do. For example, there's an awful lot of complexity in Rails that you've probably never seen because it's got a great interface hiding behind it, that is hiding behind. But if you really want to go in there and look at it, or you need to actually extend how Rails itself works, it's there. But the typical Rails programmer doesn't have to worry about the implementation of, say, has many. Right, specs. Now this can mean RSpec or mini-test using spec syntax. Here's an example from GitLab, another example where you can literally read it out and it says what it does. Something that you can lean on is that if you're struggling to make something that's fundamentally complex, simple to read and simple to understand, you can actually write it specs to cover it as well. So even if your runtime code isn't perfectly clear, you can write a very clear spec that describes both its behavior and its intent. So for humans, it's important to optimize for speed of reading, not speed of writing. Brevity is powerful, but not at the expense of clarity. So knowing our readers, we've got one more type of reader to talk about, AI coding agents. So what we can say about AI coding agents? I don't know. It's changing so quickly that anything I tell you now, it probably won't be relevant in a few months, a few years. It's certainly true that AIs read code more than they write code. And it's probably true right now that if you have a code base full of clean, clear, concise, intentional code, your coding agent is more likely to produce code like that itself. But who knows what's going to happen in the future? Is code writing? At the outset, I said code is writing. Is it writing? Code is a dialogue between a developer and a future maintainer. Each line answers an implicit question of what is it it's doing and why. And miscommunication happens when the answer is incomplete, misleading, or hidden. But is it art in the sense that writing is art? I think it can be. Engineers are creative people, and we seek forms of self-expression. I know lots of people in the Ruby community are really good musicians, and their form of self-expression is music. Julian mentioned it earlier, but he's very much not the only one. I'm not a musician. I don't have a musical bone in my body. My form of self-expression is making silly word games on the internet. That's also code. So code, I think if you want it to be, your self-expression can be writing code. So at the moment, vibe coding is new, and I think we all know that if you purely vibe code some software, you don't get great results. But that's true now. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? Maybe there'll be some future state where vibe coding produces such high quality software that we actually never need to look at the lines of code. And maybe none of this will actually matter. It might be that Ruby becomes a level of description humans don't have to worry about anymore, exactly like the Ruby bytecode I showed earlier. But this is a Ruby conference. So right now, by definition, we do care about the lines of code because they're written in Ruby. And that's what we're here for. So it is important how it communicates, how effective it is, and how it reads. So whatever you choose your self-expression to be, sing like no one is listening, love like you've never been hurt, dance like nobody's watching, and write code as if the guy who ends up maintaining it will be a violent psychopath who knows where you live. Thank you.